In a move that sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms and government offices across America, the Bank of China has done something unprecedented. It has walked away from Boeing entirely, every single aircraft order canceled. In their place stands a staggering agreement: 500 commercial jets from Europe's Airbus, half a thousand planes. This isn't merely a transaction between buyer and seller. This is geopolitical chess played at the highest level, and the board just shifted dramatically. The timing couldn't be more deliberate or more damaging. Just as President Trump extended an olive branch toward Chinese President Xi Jinping, hoping to ease years of escalating tension, Beijing delivered its response. Not through diplomatic channels or carefully worded statements, but through the language both nations understand best: money, massive amounts of it, flowing away from American manufacturers and straight into European hands. This represents retaliation with precision. When Trump launched his trade offensive, slapping tariffs on hundreds of billions worth of Chinese products, the stated goal was clear force manufacturing back to American soil, revive industries that had withered over decades, and restore the economic dominance the United States once enjoyed. Beijing listened. Beijing waited. And now Beijing is answering. The message is unmistakable. China possesses options. It can redirect its purchasing power anywhere on the planet. And in the global marketplace for commercial aviation, one of the most lucrative industries on Earth, China just chose Europe over America in the most public way imaginable. While Airbus executives toast their victory, Boeing faces what analysts are calling the most catastrophic commercial setback in the company's century-long existence. But this story extends far beyond one aerospace manufacturer. This is a warning shot heard by every American corporation with exposure to the Chinese market. Apple, Tesla, General Motors, Ford. They're all watching. They're all calculating. Because if Boeing can be cast aside, despite its size, its history, and its political connections, then no one is safe. Meanwhile, back on American soil, the promises made about reviving domestic manufacturing are colliding with harsh economic reality. Companies pledged to build new factories, hire American workers, and reverse the tide of outsourcing. They held press conferences. They shook hands with politicians. They generated glowing headlines. Yet today, those gleaming new facilities remain mostly imaginary. Labor costs are crushing, regulatory hurdles are exhausting, and the enthusiasm that once accompanied these announcements has quietly evaporated. Even members of Congress who championed reshoring are backing away from their own legislation. The political will is fading. The money isn't materializing. And increasingly, it appears that American industry simply cannot compete on the terms being demanded. China, meanwhile, is moving forward, not backward, not standing still, moving forward. And the world is watching to see who blinks first. Before we dive deeper into this unfolding crisis, make sure you're subscribed. What comes next will reshape how you understand the global economy. The tariff gambit that backfired. Donald Trump believed he held the winning hand. By imposing a staggering 145% tariff on Chinese imports, he thought he could force Beijing into submission. The theory was straightforward: make Chinese goods so expensive that American consumers would reject them, Chinese exporters would suffer, and Xi Jinping would have no choice but to negotiate on Washington's terms. That's not what's happening. Instead of capitulation, China is executing a counter-strategy that's both sophisticated and devastating. Rather than fighting tariffs head-on, Beijing is simply redirecting its economic might away from American markets and American products. This includes a quiet but significant withdrawal from one of the foundations of U.S. financial power: Treasury bonds. For years, China has been among the largest foreign holders of American government debt, essentially lending Washington the money it needs to function. That relationship is changing. China is methodically reducing its treasury holdings, a move that signals both economic and political intent. This isn't panic. This is strategy. And nowhere is that strategy more visible than in the aviation sector. While Trump attempted to project unity and cooperation during his outreach to Xi, China dropped its bombshell. No more Boeing aircraft. Not a reduction, not a delay. A complete severance. The contrast between Trump's diplomatic overtures and China's commercial rejection couldn't be starker. Boeing represents more than corporate profits. It embodies American industrial might. For generations, Boeing stood as proof that American engineering and manufacturing could dominate global markets. Chinese airlines, experiencing explosive growth over the past 2 decades, became Boeing's most important customers. In 2017 alone, roughly 1 out of every 4 Boeing aircraft rolled off production lines with Chinese buyers waiting. Then, everything started falling apart. Trade wars poisoned the relationship. The 737 MAX disasters, which killed hundreds and grounded the fleet worldwide, shattered Boeing's reputation for safety. Political tensions between Washington and Beijing intensified. By 2023, Boeing's deliveries to China had collapsed to a single aircraft, just one, down from nearly 200 only a few years earlier. Recently, there were signs of recovery. China permitted MAX deliveries to resume. The first aircraft touched down in June, generating cautious optimism that perhaps the worst was over, that commercial relationships could survive political turbulence. That optimism just died. China's pivot to Airbus isn't a minor adjustment. It's a fundamental realignment that threatens to permanently lock Boeing out of the world's fastest-growing aviation market. The human cost behind the headlines. Let's talk about what this actually means for regular people. Boeing employs over 140,000 Americans directly. These aren't abstract statistics. These are machinists in Washington State, engineers in South Carolina, technicians in Kansas. Entire towns built their economies around Boeing facilities. High schools teach courses designed to feed Boeing's workforce pipeline. Local businesses exist because Boeing workers spend their paychecks in those communities. But the impact stretches much further. For every person Boeing employs directly, several more work for suppliers manufacturing components, or for service companies maintaining aircraft, or for logistics firms moving parts. Economists estimate that Boeing's full economic footprint supports hundreds of thousands of additional jobs across dozens of industries. Now, consider the market at stake. Aviation consultants project that Chinese airlines will purchase more than 8,000 new aircraft by the year 2040. The total value exceeds $1 trillion. If Boeing loses access to that market, we're not talking about a quarterly earnings disappointment. We're talking about a generational loss that would reverberate through American manufacturing for decades. Lost sales translate to slower production lines. Slower production means fewer workers needed. Fewer workers means plant closures and layoffs. And once that specialized workforce disperses, once those skills fade, rebuilding becomes exponentially harder. This is how industrial capacity dies, not suddenly, but through 1,000 small defeats until one day you look around and realize the capability no longer exists. While Boeing confronts existential questions, Airbus is experiencing something close to euphoria. When news broke about China's potential 500 aircraft order, Airbus shares surged immediately. Investors recognized what they were seeing, not just a business win, but a geopolitical realignment with profound implications. The market's response was swift and unambiguous. Airbus stock climbed 4% within hours, reaching 6% gains within 3 trading days. Boeing's shares, meanwhile, slipped about 0.7%, a relatively modest decline that nonetheless reflected growing uncertainty about the company's future in China. Financial markets excel at reading between the lines, and the message they're receiving is clear. China is punishing Boeing while embracing Airbus. Reports indicate this massive aircraft order is being prepared to coincide with a visit from European political leaders to Beijing. The symbolism is deliberate. While America gets rejection, Europe gets red carpets and billion-dollar contracts. The exact composition remains uncertain, but industry insiders suggest the order will include a mix of narrow-body and wide-body jets, predominantly from Airbus's A320 and A350 families. This would rank among the largest aviation deals in history. More importantly, it represents a strategic economic shift. China is demonstrating that it can reward friends and punish adversaries through its procurement decisions, and that American companies no longer hold monopolistic positions in critical industries. The numbers already favor Airbus in the Chinese market. Over 1,100 Airbus aircraft currently operate with Chinese carriers compared to roughly 600 Boeing jets. The backlog tells an even more dramatic story. Airbus holds orders for more than 500 aircraft from Chinese customers, while Boeing's backlog has shrunk to about 160. China isn't tapping the brakes. It's accelerating away from Boeing at maximum speed. If this trajectory continues, Boeing risks complete exclusion from a market that was supposed to define its future growth. Boeing's situation should terrify executives at every major American corporation with Chinese exposure. This cancellation establishes a template, a playbook for how Beijing can respond to American trade aggression without firing a shot or imposing formal sanctions. Apple generates enormous revenue from China, both through sales and manufacturing. Tesla operates massive production facilities in Shanghai. General Motors and Ford depend heavily on Chinese consumers. All of them are vulnerable. China could raise taxes targeting American brands. It could delay regulatory approvals indefinitely. It could encourage domestic consumers to choose local alternatives. It could make doing business in China so difficult and unprofitable that these companies have no choice but to scale back. And here's the uncomfortable truth. These companies cannot easily leave China. The market is too large, too profitable, and too deeply integrated into their global operations. Walking away would devastate their bottom lines and send their stock prices plummeting. They're trapped, dependent on Chinese goodwill that can evaporate at Beijing's discretion. So the question becomes, will these companies ever truly leave China? The answer is more complicated and more troubling than most politicians want to admit. Promises without substance. Bringing manufacturing back to America has become a political rallying cry. It sounds inspiring. It feels patriotic. It generates applause at campaign events and trending hashtags on social media. But underneath this carefully orchestrated narrative lies a much darker reality. These corporate announcements about returning production to the United States aren't genuine industrial strategies. They're public relations exercises. They're designed to deflect political criticism and generate positive headlines while actual factories remain overseas, churning out products using cheap foreign labor. The economics explain why. Manufacturing in the United States is expensive, genuinely expensive. American workers rightfully earn higher wages than their counterparts in developing nations. Environmental regulations are stricter. Safety standards are enforced. Land costs more. Energy costs more. Legal compliance costs more. Every aspect of domestic production carries premium pricing. It's vastly cheaper, simpler, and more profitable to maintain factories in China, Vietnam, India, or Mexico, where labor costs are fractional and regulatory oversight is minimal. As of 2025, the average manufacturing wage in China hovers around $1,100 monthly. In the United States, that figure exceeds $5,900, not including benefits, insurance, or union protections. Labor alone makes American manufacturing 6 to 8 times more expensive. Beyond wages, China's government aggressively subsidizes industrial production. Electricity, land, raw materials, all receive state support, allowing factories to operate on razor-thin margins while remaining profitable. China has poured over $230 billion specifically into supporting electric vehicle manufacturers. That's just one sector. Imagine that level of support across all industries. Additionally, Compliance with American environmental, safety, and labor regulations adds bureaucratic costs that Chinese factories often bypass entirely. China also benefits from economies of scale that would take decades to replicate elsewhere. Entire cities like Shenzhen have evolved into optimized manufacturing ecosystems with vertically integrated supply chains concentrated in tight geographic areas. American manufacturers, in contrast, face logistics fragmentation, union labor negotiations, zoning battles, higher corporate taxes, and endless regulatory reviews. The idea that companies will voluntarily accept these costs and complications for patriotic reasons is naive. Apple's empty promises, a case study in deception. Didn't Apple announce it was bringing manufacturing home? That's what the headlines proclaimed. But as always, the reality hiding beneath those headlines tells a very different story. We need to look backward to understand the pattern. In 2012, facing intense pressure from government officials and consumer advocates, Apple's CEO Tim Cook made a bold declaration. The company would begin producing certain Mac computers in the United States. Media outlets celebrated this as a turning point, proof that even tech giants could choose national interest over pure profit maximization. The result? A handful of Mac Pro units assembled in Texas. No iPhones, no iPads, no meaningful restoration of American manufacturing capacity. Apple did just enough to generate positive press coverage, but nowhere near enough to actually transform their supply chain or create substantial American jobs. This pattern is repeating itself. Facing renewed threats of tariffs and trade penalties from Trump's administration, Apple is once again singing the reshoring anthem. Press releases emphasize investments in American innovation and partnerships with U.S. suppliers. But follow the money, and you'll discover those billions of dollars are actually flowing toward India, not Indiana. Apple has mentioned a $500 billion investment in U.S. iPhone production, but Trump's administration doesn't believe them anymore. That's why Apple has been denied tariff exemptions. The trust is gone. Apple isn't reshoring. They're rerouting, moving production from China to other low-cost countries while maintaining minimal presence in America for political cover. India offers lower labor costs, political stability, and strategic distance from U.S.-China tensions. The shift is calculated and profit-driven. If Apple, with its trillion-dollar market capitalization and enormous profit margins, won't genuinely commit to American manufacturing, what hope exists for financially stressed automakers or struggling apparel companies? The corporate chorus of broken promises. Ford and General Motors loudly proclaim loyalty to American workers while quietly sourcing batteries and components from China or relocating entire operations to Mexico. Nike, Levi's, and countless consumer goods manufacturers flirt with reshoring in press statements while keeping actual production in Vietnam, Bangladesh, or Cambodia, where labor costs are absurdly low and environmental regulations barely exist. These corporations understand the calculation perfectly. Reshoring would spike production costs, forcing them to raise prices dramatically. American consumers, accustomed to globally produced cheap goods, would rebel at $1,200 iPhones or $150 jeans. Higher prices mean lower sales. Lower sales mean disappointed shareholders and plummeting stock values. Nothing terrifies corporate leadership more than angry investors. Congress abandons the fight. When you examine what's actually happening in Congress, the rhetoric about reshoring collapses completely. The same politicians who deliver passionate speeches about bringing jobs home are quietly undermining the legislation necessary to make it happen. Consider the American Competitiveness Act. Originally, this bill contained strong provisions requiring companies to actually manufacture in the United States before receiving government subsidies. By the time it passed, those requirements had been watered down beyond recognition. Now corporations can receive tax breaks while building factories overseas. American taxpayers are subsidizing foreign job creation. This isn't a minor legislative tweak. It's evidence that lawmakers no longer genuinely believe in rebuilding American industrial capacity. Instead of investing in modern factories, workforce training, or domestic supply chain development, they've retreated to familiar territory, tax cuts, and deregulation. These policies might sound appealing, but they don't create manufacturing jobs or build new facilities on American soil. In fact, they often make it easier for companies to chase cheaper labor abroad. The data confirms this abandonment. Fewer businesses are reshoring in 2025 compared to previous years, despite record corporate profits and higher tariffs making foreign goods more expensive. Even with ostensibly favorable conditions, companies aren't interested in American manufacturing. The Trump administration continues insisting that China desperately needs access to American markets. That narrative becomes less accurate every day. Within the past year, U.S. exports to China have fallen sharply as Beijing systematically reduces dependence on American goods. Chinese companies have learned to thrive through diversification and expanding domestic consumption. Today, only 15% of revenue for publicly listed Chinese firms comes from overseas markets, and merely 2 to 3% originates from the United States specifically. This explains why Chinese stocks remain resilient even as exports to America decline. China's growth engine is no longer the American consumer. It's China's own rising middle class, now numbering in the hundreds of millions. If China can afford to decouple from the United States, can America afford the same separation? The numbers are devastating. In April 2025 alone, U.S. exports to China fell 21%. Chinese exports to the United States are projected to collapse by 77% over the full year. This isn't a trade slowdown or a temporary disruption. This is a trade implosion. Tariffs work both ways, and Beijing has retaliated with triple-digit tariffs on key American goods. U.S. exporters, particularly in agriculture, technology, and heavy manufacturing, are facing an existential crisis. Ocean shipping data reveals that U.S. container exports dropped 78%, down to merely 57,000 2020-foot equivalent units. International buyers aren't walking away because of political disagreements. They're walking away because America is no longer the cheapest option, the fastest supplier, or the most essential trading partner. What happens when the world no longer needs what America sells? When other countries can manufacture better products at lower costs? When geopolitical tensions make American goods politically unpalatable? We're witnessing the early stages of that transformation right now. Boeing's loss represents more than one company's misfortune. It symbolizes a fundamental shift in global economic power. For decades, American companies assumed Chinese customers would always prefer American products. That assumption is dying. The promises of reshoring, of revitalizing American manufacturing, of returning to some imagined golden age of industrial dominance. These are fantasies colliding with mathematical reality. Companies won't voluntarily sacrifice profits for patriotism. Workers won't accept wages that match developing world standards. And consumers won't pay premium prices for American-made goods when cheaper alternatives exist. China is moving forward, building its domestic market, reducing foreign dependence, and demonstrating it can punish American companies at will. Meanwhile, America clings to promises that won't be kept, policies that won't work, and assumptions about economic leverage that no longer reflect reality. The next chapter of this economic confrontation is just beginning. What happens next will determine whether American industry can adapt and survive, or whether we're watching the slow-motion collapse of economic assumptions that have guided policy for generations. The Boeing cancellation isn't the end of this story. It's a warning of what's coming. Subscribe now, because what happens next will reshape the global economic order in ways most people haven't begun to imagine.